รายการต่อไปนี้เป็นรายการทั่วไปสามารถรับชมได้ทุกวัย
สนับสนุนโดย AIS ใช้ชีวิตได้มากกว่า
ไทม์ไลน์สุทธิชัยหยุดอาทิตย์นี้ต่อจากสัปดาห์ที่แล้วครับเป็นการสนทนากับประธานกาชาดสากลปีเตอร์โมโรซึ่งมีหน้าที่ที่จะให้ความขัดแย้งทั่วโลกไม่ว่าใครจะรบราฆ่าฟันกับใครต้องพิจารณาว่าจะต้องปฏิบัติต่อเหยื่อของความรุนแรงนั้นอย่างมีมนุษยธรรมยากครับ ICRC International Committee of the Red Cross มีบทบาทสากลโดยอ้างอิงต่ออนุสัญญาว่าด้วยการปฏิบัติอย่างมีมนุษยธรรมซึ่งแน่นอนครับท้าทายเป็นอย่างยิ่งในภาวะที่ความรุนแรงก็เปลี่ยนรูปแบบสมัยก่อนเป็นการรบกันด้วยกองทัพต่อมาก็เป็นความขัดแย้งภายในที่มีความรุนแรงระหว่างกลุ่มคนทั้งศาสนาทั้งวัฒนธรรมและผลประโยชน์ต่างๆรวมไปถึงความขัดแย้งที่เกิดขึ้นจากสงครามออนไลน์ที่เรียกว่าไซเบอร์วอร์แฟร์ซึ่งไม่เคยปรากฏมาก่อนการก่อตั้ง ICRC เมื่อ150 ปีก่อนก็ไม่มีใครคาดคิดว่าความขัดแย้งนั้นจะถูกเทคโนโลยีนำไปสู่ความรุนแรงอีกระดับหนึ่งในฐานะเป็นประธานกาชาดสากลคุณปีเตอร์โมโรมองอย่างไรกับกรณีที่กลุ่มคนถืออาวุธและใช้ความรุนแรงเป็นหลักเช่น ISIS หรือว่ากลุ่มที่เรียกร้องให้มีความเปลี่ยนแปลงด้วยวิธีการรุนแรงหรือกรณีที่จะเกิดสงครามในภูมิภาคต่างๆผมยกตัวอย่างกรณีทะเลจีนใต้โอกาสที่จะเกิดสงครามความขัดแย้งรุนแรง ICRC จะมีบทบาทอย่างไรบ้างคุณปีเตอร์โมโรเวลาดูข่าวกับผมเวลาดูข่าวต่างกันอย่างไรในฐานะคนที่จะต้องดูว่าความขัดแย้งเกิดที่ไหนจะไปช่วยเหลือที่ไหนได้ทันท่วงทีโดยไม่ถือข้างโดยไม่แบ่งฝักแบ่งฝ่ายอันตรายที่เกิดขึ้นปีๆเนี่ยเจ้าหน้าที่ของ ICRC หรือกาชาดสากลบาดเจ็บล้มตายและถูกทำร้ายร่างกายมากน้อยแค่ไหนอย่างไรเข้าไปในจุดอันตรายที่สุดของโลกเอาตัวรอดมาได้อย่างไรวันนี้จะได้สนทนากับประธานกาชาดสากลต่อครับ Nature of violence has also changed.
The nature
the type of violence and conflict has also been transformed. We see this suicide bombing, we see ISIS, we see a lot of internal conflicts that are spreading to other neighboring countries, which is different from, say, 10 or 20 years ago, right?
Indeed. I mean, as a humanitarian organization, we know for 150 years that conflicts and violence are continuously changing in terms of actors, weapons used, and strategies in which those actors are engaged and the battlefields that we are looking at. We started during interstate warfare when armies were confronted in the middle of nowhere and were shooting at each other in the north of Italy. We are finding ourselves in protracted internal conflicts with a multiplicity of armed groups with no protocols in terms of respect for international humanitarian law really engaging and respected by those actors. We see new types of warfare and violence, in particular against civilians. We see violence moving to the cities. Increasingly, we see war in densely populated areas. So we see new weapons, new actors, new strategies, new battlefields, and new technologies in weapons as well.
So now we have cyber war as well.
We have elements of what I would call cyber warfare, although the definition may vary that is given today, but I mean it's the use of virtual and of the cyberspace as an element of warfare. Today, through cyberspace, you can incapacitate the electricity supply of a city, the water supply of a city. And so today's conflicts, either in terms of weapons, warfare, actors can have a deep impact on how the civilian populations and those not participating in warfare are exposed to those new forms of warfare and these challenges.
How does ICRC cope with the new technology? Because you would need new definition, new framework, new kind of activities to cope with the so-called cyber warfare. Who are the victims? And how do you define humanitarianism in a cyber warfare situation?
Well, because of the newness of this situation, let me just recall briefly the core mandate that ICRC has received from all signatories to the Geneva Conventions, and this is all states of the world have signed. 193.
Okay, all of them?
All of
without
them.
Exception?
Without exception. It's the largest ratified convention worldwide.
But you cannot get armed groups to sign?
No.
Not only states?
Only states.
But non-states?
Non-state are not signatories, but it doesn't mean that they are not also bound by the Geneva Conventions. But let me say that ICRC, through those conventions, has an obligation and an entitlement to look at new weapons and to engage with states in order to assess the humanitarian impact of those weapons. So what we are doing with regard to drones, with regard to automated warfare, with regard to cyber warfare is engaging with those states with the capacity to engage in those types of warfare in order to find a broader consensus on how to define the issues and how to assess the humanitarian impact, and eventually to ask those countries, should we work, is humanitarian law as it stands today sufficient to cope with those new challenges, or has the law to be amended, completed, negotiated in a new way? And I think at the present moment we don't have an answer to this question. We have, by and large, a lot of countries, including, it is the opinion of the ICRC that international humanitarian law as it stands carries us very far in also assessing the impact of those new weapons. We think that the law is applicable to those new weapons. The principle of distinguishing between civilians and militaries is very much also applicable to those new weapons. The question is it possible to distinguish between civilian and military attacks when you are in the cyberspace?
Yeah,
it's very difficult.
Because you cannot say you are doing this, you're hacking this, you're trying to conduct a cyber war with your enemy, and you try to distinguish between civilians and the military side. Besides, if a country or a non-state body decides to engage in cyber warfare, I think the last thing they would think of is humanitarianism. I don't think that comes anywhere near the top priority of these people. So ICRC would have great difficulty in convincing them that you should cooperate with us to discuss how we can provide humanitarian treatment or assistance to the victims, your victims. Am I right or wrong?
You are right, but what you say is not limited to new weapons and warfares.
Right.
Let's
First
not
World
forget.
War, Second World War.
Well, even today, let's not forget, we have record numbers of refugees and internally displaced people in the world. Most of them are refugees from violence. And violence is today, real violence, very traditional warfare, very traditional weapons are displacing and affecting civilian populations in millions of numbers. So it is not only that a legal issue of new weapons. Today's reality is that most of the people are killed because of conventional small arms and light weapons. Most people are killed because of mines and unexploded ordnances, or they are wounded in situations of conflict.
But how can ICRC reduce the number of small arms and weapons?
Well, we have supported over the last couple of years, as we have supported throughout our history, the work of states and the negotiations of states to contain the transfer and of small arms and light weapons. The Arms Trade Treaty, for instance, has been negotiated with great support of ICRC. The Ottawa Conventions on banning anti-personnel mines has been elaborated and negotiated with the great participation of ICRC, and ICRC is engaged also in the implementation of those conventions by having mine awareness programs, assisting mine victims, and of course trying to assist and protect people who are suffering from the impact of real violence. My point here is only to tell you, compliance with international law is not limited to new weapons, new actors, new warfares.
So the old
it's
weapons.
A continuous challenge that we face as an organization to engage with state and non-state actors in order that they know the law, they respect the law, and this is of course a challenge because we all know that the law is not sufficiently respected in none of the conflicts in which we are active today.
The number of ICRC officials harmed, injured, or killed in the past 5 years, has it been going up or has it?
สนับสนุนโดย AIS ใช้ชีวิตได้มากกว่า
So what are the big challenges ahead of your mission? In the next 4 to 5 years, you see conflicts getting worse, new type of violence, challenging your ability to fulfill your mission.
Well, let me be very frank. 3 years ago, when I started at ICRC, there was a general atmosphere in my organization that conflicts and violence were basically running out.
Yes.
And that ICRC would rather get a smaller organization in the future.
Work itself out of a job.
Work ourselves out of a job. So we didn't plan to grow.
No.
We have grown more than 50% in 3 years. And unfortunately, I don't see much hope at the present moment, given the status of international relations. If I look at the conflict even on the European continent between superpowers over Ukraine, if I look at the power competition in the Middle East between regional powers, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Israel, you name it.
South China Sea.
If we look at the South China Sea with
East
so
China
many,
Sea, Japan,
with
China, South
so
China
many
Sea.
powers engaged
Yes.
here, we fear that there is a lot of reason. But we have talked about power competition. We see that societies are in turmoil. They are increasingly polarized.
Yes.
There is injustice, exclusion, discrimination leading to more violence in many parts of the world.
Yes.
So I do fear that in many parts of the world we will be needed as we are today. And in many parts of the world, unfortunately, ICRC and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement are very often the only responder at international level, or one of the only responders.
Right.
If I look at today's conflict in eastern Ukraine, in the north of Mali, in Nigeria and Niger, in the south of Somalia, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in rural Afghanistan, in some of the most difficult parts of Myanmar or of the southern Philippines, ICRC is amongst the only international actors delivering humanitarian services. And I think this will unfortunately not disappear, and we will be challenged to grow our operations because needs are growing.
It means more work for you. That
I
means
fear-
more difficult work for you.
I fear you are right. I'm always surprised by the better, if the better happens. And I don't want to talk the world into negativism.
Right.
But I think we have to be realistic. The situation is as it is, and we are most likely, we will become an even more important organization. We are today responding with a budget of 1.5 billion Swiss francs, dollars, whatever you take as a currency. We have 14,000 staff members worldwide in 80 countries, and I fear it won't be less in a couple of years.
Give you an example of the phenomenon of ISIS, for example. How does ICRC engage ISIS fighters in a dialogue about humanitarian treatment?
Well, ISIS, and not limited to ISIS, we are confronted in many battlefields with non-state armed groups who do not spontaneously embrace international humanitarian laws and values.
No.
ICRC's approach for a very long time has always been that we are seeking dialogue and proximity to those actors in order to convince them what the law is, and that this law is not a Western value law, but it is deeply rooted in each and every society worldwide, and that it should be respected even if politically you disagree with the future orientation of the country in which you are. And so we do seek, as good as we can, proximity and engagement of those actors in order to convince them about the importance of humanity, of humanitarian principles, of international humanitarian law. We engage with religious leaders who may have an influence on those actors. We talk to major opinion leaders. We try to build networks. Some of the actors in today's Islamic State are people whom ICRC knows because we have visited them when they were in prison.
Oh, yes.
In future times, in past times, and we have visited.
So you know the personalities involved.
We know some of the personality. We try to build a relationship and to try to seek to explain to them why certain behaviors are not compatible with universal standards of humanity, which are so important to respect.
But if they don't listen to you, there's nothing you can do about it.
Humanitarianism is a consensual affair. I mean, as humanitarian organization, we don't have a law enforcement capabilities. If there is no law enforcement capabilities, we are relying on consensus.
Yes.
If consensus fails, if conviction fails, if we are over time not able to talk armed actors into better respect of international law, I think this is the limits of the humanitarian space.
Right.
And here there is the responsibility of political actors sinking in. We can't become a humanitarian army.
Yes.
We are civilian humanitarian actors working without weapons, with the word as and conviction as our our only weapon. So we try to convince them that it is in their own interest to respect and to enlarge this area of activity, but we can't enforce. It's others, political actors,
How
who
would
have
you
to
rate
enforce.
the success rate of ICRC's engagement with these armed groups around the world?
Well, I would say we have a humanizing effect on many of those groups, but I would recognize that this effect is normally happening not as fast as we would like it to happen and as comprehensively as we would like it to happen. What happens concretely today? I mean, in the Middle East, we do engage in training international humanitarian law to some of those non-state actors. We bring them together in some places. We tell them what the applicable law is, and we see that much of what we do in that respect has a positive effect. They do recognize at least some of their responsibilities in treating detainees better, in allowing ICRC to have access to detainees, in allowing ICRC to engage in a humanitarian operations, to supply hospitals with medicine and medical instruments, to access civilian populations. So there is a certain success rate which, by the nature of the conflicts today, is always insufficient and too late. But this is what encourages us to enhance our effort.
The number of ICRC officials harmed, injured, or killed in the past 5 years, has it been going up or has it maintained its level?
Well, overall, we do have a very stable development. We have had certainly an unclear development. Sometimes we have had a little bit more attacks, sometimes a little bit less. The overall picture is very stable. And this is despite the fact that ICRC is increasingly working closer to some of the most dangerous situations. So, to come back to your previous questions, it illustrates that at least ICRC has a certain effect on minimizing the attacks on our staff. Having said that, I am each and every day concerned, as we are, because when I mentioned you all the conflicts in which we are, these are contexts which are just very dangerous. Even if we don't have deliberate attacks on ICRC, which happens from time to time, there is the issue of collateral damage. And many of our colleagues are operating in some of the most seriously risky situations. And I think they deserve praise for the courage they show and for the work they do in order to access populations in some of those circumstances.
What are the 5 most dangerous countries as far as ICRC is concerned?
We don't make hit lists on where it is more dangerous than in other places. We don't have a categorization. We take wherever we are and wherever we are operating, we do a contextual reading of our security exposure, and we try to engage in mitigating measures in order to have safe and secure humanitarian activities unfolding. But the whole region, which I have described as being the focus of our operation, is a dangerous region. The most dangerous parts for us are those parts where we haven't been for a long time. Most of the time when ICRC has been known and is engaged in a conflict for a long time, this is the best insurance policy for the ICRC. when we are new arrivals in a conflict, when we are in a new conflict, this is most of the time more dangerous. It's not by chance that we lost 3 of our staff members last year in Libya, in the Central African Republic, and in Ukraine. It's these 3 places where ICRC have engaged newly in Ukraine. It has engaged much more comprehensively in the Central African Republic. And in Libya, we have been engaged only since 2011, compared to other exposures where ICRC has been for decades active, like in Iraq or in Yemen or in Afghanistan. This is very different and gives us more comfort that our operation can be delivered securely and safely.
I can imagine you waking up in the middle of the night with watching news, breaking news about new conflict somewhere, and imagine how your people will be handling it and how dangerous that place is. So you are watching news not like us. As a reporter, when we watch news, a new conflict, we ask ourselves, how do we cover that story? I don't know. When you watch news, what does your mind tell you?
Well, indeed. I mean, when I watch news and when I look at my phone and my messages, the first concern is always, what does this mean for either an existing operation of ICRC or a still non-existing operation of ICRC? And do we need to react and respond? And as humanitarians, I think it's sometimes difficult to foresee what the future bears. But it is critical for an organization like mine to be fast in our response. So we have considerably increased our efforts in the past couple of years to be able to respond rapidly to whatever crisis emerge. And I think this is where I'm most proud of my organization, because we are able to deploy teams in a short period of time to build up an operation. Within 24 hours, we can mobilize people to cope with any kind of outbreak of violence and conflict. And this makes the strength of this organization, but also the worry of its president.
Well, despite our quite pessimistic outlook of conflict in the world, I think ICRC provides that small little hope in this very dangerous world. So I congratulate you on this very important mission. Every time I watch news, fighting breaks out and I see ICRC's flag or the jeep that ICRC brings into the conflict area providing medicine, food, at least I see some hope that there is some humanitarian feeling about the war. So thank you for this big mission.
Thank you very much. You just said something extremely important to us as well. We are always happy to assist and protect people in need in those conflicts, but the most important element is really that we give a reason for hope, and you formulated it very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samora.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
หลังจากบทสนทนาวันนี้แล้วต่อไปนี้ผมติดตามข่าวสารเนี่ยและทุกครั้งที่เห็นธงกาชาดสากลหรือว่ามีคำประกาศว่า ICRC เข้าไปช่วยเหลือเหยื่อของความขัดแย้งหรือสงครามเนี่ยผมจะมองบทบาท ICRC ผิดแผกแตกต่างไปจากในอดีตที่ผ่านมาครับเพราะว่าเข้าใจแล้วครับว่าสิ่งที่ท้าทายและสิ่งที่ยากลำบากสำหรับ ICRC คนที่ต้องการที่จะเข้าไปช่วยเหลือเหยื่อของความขัดแย้งโดยไม่ถือข้างไม่ถือฝักถือฝ่ายนั้นยากลำบากอันตรายอย่างไรแต่อย่างน้อยที่สุดทุกครั้งที่เราเห็นกาชาดสากลเข้าไปเราก็ต้องเชื่อว่าในสงครามในความขัดแย้งในความตายความบาดเจ็บนั้นยังมีความหวังครับว่าจะมีคนที่เสี่ยงภัยเข้าไปช่วยเหลือคนที่เป็นเหยื่อของสถานการณ์โดยเฉพาะเด็กผู้หญิงคนแก่ พลเรือนที่ไม่ได้เกี่ยวข้องกับสงครามเขาเหล่านั้นรัฐบาลหรือคู่กรณีไม่ดูแลก็ต้องอาศัยกาชาดสากลนี่แหละครับและนี่คือไทม์ไลน์สุทธิชัยหยุ่นสัปดาห์นี้ครับวันนี้เวลาหมดแล้วครับสวัสดีครับ